December 12, 2003, Somerville, New Jersey. Amy Loughren, a nurse at Somerset Medical Center, was about to see her dear friend at a restaurant, but her mind couldn't be further from the concept of having a good time. She was wearing a wire, and the friend she was about to meet was already in the news. He was suspected to be a cold-blooded serial killer. Reverend Florian Gall was on the mend. He'd been diagnosed with sepsis and pneumonia and was on a ventilator in the hospital. Still, his friends and relatives knew that he'd been gravely ill before, but had always bounced back. When the hospital officials suggested taking him off the ventilator, Gall's family unanimously said no. They strongly believed he'd recover. And yet, on June 28, 2003, the Reverend suddenly died. A pharmacist at Somerset got seriously alarmed. Something bad was happening at the hospital. People were dying unexpectedly, and several patients had abnormally high insulin levels. The pharmacist called New Jersey's Poison Control Center, asking for help with dosage calculations. Dr. Stephen Marcus, the center's director, quickly realized it was no ordinary situation.
My number 1, 2, and 3 thought was that there was something malicious going on in the institution.
Marcus made an urgent conference call to the hospital's medical director, Dr. William Coors.
This is a police matter. What we're wrestling with is, throwing the whole institution into chaos versus, responsibility to, protect patients from further harm. And we have been trying to investigate this to get some more information before we made any kind of rush to, judgment.
If there is somebody out there that is purposely doing this to individuals at your hospital, we have a legal obligation to report this.
Okay.
Hospital officials fulfilled the obligation in 3 months. Meanwhile, 5 more people lost their lives, all showing the same symptoms. They'd been shot with abnormal doses of medicine.
5 that we know of. But those 5 deaths I'll remember them the rest of my life. Sorry.
They didn't have to happen.
They should have been preventable, yes.
It was in October that Somerset officials finally reported the matter to the police, and 2 detectives, Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin, were assigned to the case. They'd been given the names of 2 employees the hospital singled out during their own internal investigation, but otherwise, the medical staff were summarily uncooperative.
How helpful was the hospital? They were very helpful by answering court-issued subpoenas. That was the extent of their cooperation.
On top of that, when the detectives requested a look into the records of the Pyxis machine, the hospital's medicine dispenser, they were told it wouldn't do them any good. It only stored the data from the past 30 days. However, having contacted the factory, the detectives learned otherwise.
They lied to you.
Yes, they did.
Do you think they tried to obstruct your investigation?
They didn't try to help it, that's for sure.
But the detectives had plenty of clues without the hospital's help. A quick background check of the 2 suspicious employees set off the alarms. One of them had been arrested for stalking a nurse co-worker while employed at another hospital in East Pennsylvania. A trooper from Pennsylvania State Police had inquired about the very suspect just weeks prior. The hospital had an abnormal level of death to it as well. And it just so happened that the fatality spike coincided with the time one Charles Cullen, an intensive care unit nurse, was employed there, and now, the very same Cullen was working at Somerset. When the Somerset officials learned that the detectives zoomed in on a certain suspect, they scrambled to save face and promptly fired Cullen, on the pretext of his lying in his job application. All detectives Braun and Baldwin were left to work with was mere circumstantial evidence. Was Nurse Cullen truly their man? They knew they needed help, and fast. Amy Loughren was their best bet. The woman also worked at Somerset's intensive care unit, and Cullen was not only her co-worker, he was her friend.
Well, he was my work husband. Mm-hmm. So we worked together almost every shift. He had actually changed his schedule so that we could work together because we were such a good team.
Loughren and Cullen bonded at work. In Amy's own words, it's the kind of bond soldiers acquire fighting together on the front lines. The Charles Cullen Amy knew was a caring, gentle person, so it's only natural she didn't take the detective's words for granted. After all, they suspected him of not just a few accidental deaths. They were building a case of a serial killer responsible for dozens and dozens of lives lost.
and I didn't believe them. It was just absolutely devastating when I saw the evidence that there's no other reason to pull out the amount of medications that he was pulling out of our Pyxis machine. There's no possible way that he could have been using those medications for anything but something very deadly.
Sitting in the restaurant, Amy and her friend Charles talked about this and that, shaking their heads over his lost job. Finally, Amy gathered all her strength and said that she'd heard about the accusations and knew he was guilty. Cullen's look hardened. Amy read him like a book and pressed the matter. She suggested they go to the nearest police station together and be done with it. Cullen tensed and said, "I want to go down fighting." It was the moment Amy knew for sure her friend was indeed the heartless killer. The detectives arrested him just when the meeting ended, but Cullen refused to cooperate and the evidence was still lacking. Once again, the police asked Amy for help. It's something she felt particularly guilty about. She had to manipulate Cullen a bit to get him to confess. Amy told him that the police were considering her a suspect as well.
I remember saying to him, "So, who was your first victim? And was it a long time ago? Was it recent?" And he started to talk. He said it was a long time ago.
Amy and Cullen continued to stay in touch for a while until someone sent the offender, the good nurse, a book detailing his case. Finally, his suspicions were confirmed too. His friend, Amy, sold him out. Furious, Cullen ceased all communications with her. Looking at the man, one might easily understand how both Amy and other hospital workers didn't see Cullen as a threat. The soft-spoken, intelligent, thin loner looked anything but violent. He fathered 2 kids from a failed marriage and worked hard to keep up with the alimony. That was the Charles Cullen the people around him knew, the personality he chose to present to the public. The other Charles Cullen was a severely depressed, heavy drinker with a strong vindictive trait and murderous drive. He was living a miserable, lonely life. In his twisted mind, his only chance to exact any kind of control over it was by severing the lifelines of his patients. The number of Cullen's victims is staggering. He himself confessed to 40 such crimes over his 16-year career, but it is suspected the number may be much bigger.
I would be very surprised, as would pretty much everyone I've spoken to with any knowledge of this case, if it was not in the hundreds, multiple hundreds.
It's scary to consider the fact that the hospitals he'd worked at had strong suspicions of foul play but failed to alert the police.
I think what I was most afraid of was the hospital, because I saw that the hospital was seeing what I saw on that paperwork. So I knew that they knew. And if they didn't know, then that was just as dangerous.
Despite the overwhelming negligence of the hospital officials, Cullen had had a couple of close calls. In September 1993, a 91-year-old patient at Warren Hospital reported that Cullen, her assigned nurse, had come into her room and injected her with a needle. She passed away the next day. Her son protested that her death was not natural, and the hospital administered a lie detector test to Cullen, which he passed. Cullen continued to work at Warren until the following spring. In June 2002, 7 of Cullen's co-workers at St. Luke's Hospital alerted the Lehigh County District Attorney of their suspicions that he had used medical substances to murder patients. But investigators never looked into Cullen's past, and the case was dropped for lack of evidence. Despite the bad rep, Cullen continued to find work because of a national shortage of nurses. On top of that, no reporting mechanism yet existed to identify nurses with mental health or employment problems. And yes, hospital officials and staff feared for their own reputation. During the victim impact hearings, Cullen sat impassively, with his eyes closed, mumbling a prayer. The hearings brimmed with emotions. At one point, the mother of Christopher Hardgrove screamed at Cullen, gripping a photograph of her dead 38-year-old son. Charles, why don't you look up at me, huh? What are you, asleep?" The prayers didn't help. Cullen's cheek twitched at the screams. He heard everything all right. However, the man didn't offer any kind of apology. At first, Cullen claimed to have simply delivered coup de grace to his patients so that they wouldn't code. But some of his victims were young, some were on the mend. It didn't make any sense. In the end, He couldn't or simply wouldn't give an explanation for his crimes.
Like I said, I can't. I just can say that it was more or less, felt like I needed to do something. And I did. And that's not an answer to anything.
On the other hand, Cullen was deeply upset when Judge William Platt made some unflattering comments about him to the press. In court, he stood up, recited the remarks from his memory, and concluded the tirade with the following demand: "For this reason, Your Honor, you need to step down." "Your motion to recuse is denied," was the reply. Cullen was fuming. "Your Honor, you need to step down," he kept shouting, not paying any attention to the judge's calls for order. Finally, the officers pulled a spit mask over his head and secured it with a towel, but the noise didn't let up, even when they duct taped his mouth shut. This only goes to show how much of a psychopath Cullen was. Having taken so many lives and showing no remorse for his deeds, he freaked out over a petty matter like a passing comment to the press. As of now, Cullen rots behind bars, serving his 18 consecutive life sentences. For years, Amy Loughren had been struggling to come to grips with the guilt over her betrayal of a friend, and her inability to notice foul play early on. She later learned that Cullen had taken the lives of several patients before her very eyes, but time heals, and Amy provided invaluable assistance in the investigation and the making of both The Good Nurse, a motion picture based on Charles Graeber's book of the same name, and a brand new documentary detailing the case. In recent years, the healthcare system has been growing more effective in weeding elements like Cullen out of their midst. After all, hospitals are meant to save lives, not vice versa. Stay safe.